patience is the ability to endure opposition and criticism and so on without anger, then gentleness is the ability to endure such things without aggression. Gentleness is learning how to respond to criticism or rejection or wrong things that are done to us, not with bluster and self-defense and a kind of harsh, aggressive attitude that comes back, not to be full of prickles and spikes when people are not quite what we want them to be, but rather to respond with softness, without rage, without bitterness, actually because we're really aware that I am just as flawed and human and failing as anybody else, and the other person who's doing wrong to me, well, they may well be hurting just as I am, and if I respond with aggression, it's only going to make things worse. Gentleness is also very close to humility. In fact, they sometimes come together. When you look at Ephesians chapter 4 verse 2, when Paul is bringing the very first thing that he says his new believers should do when they are walking in a way that is consistent with their calling, is he says, be completely humble and gentle. That's his teaching. Now, in the ancient world that Paul grew up in, the world of Greece and Rome, gentleness and humility were not really regarded as very good virtues to have. Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, he included gentleness, the word that Paul uses, on his list of virtues. For him, it was a kind of golden mean in between, on the one hand, excessive anger and rage, and on the other hand, the inability to get angry about anything. And so Aristotle says gentleness is the middle road. But humility was actually despised in the ancient world. It was not a virtue at all. Real men were heroes. Real men wanted to exercise power and athleticism and dominance and skill and be heroic. And that is, of course, something of a myth that has still come down into us through Hollywood movies and through all the sort of superheroes that we read about, men in capes, people who are irresistible, who are powerful and who know what to do. And the biblical virtue of gentleness is the diametric opposite of those things, but it is still regarded as strength and as a fruit of the Holy Spirit. Let's think first of all about the gentleness of God in the Old Testament. Now, that's possibly not a quality of God that you would immediately associate with the so-called God of the Old Testament, and yet when you read it, the psalmists and the prophets often speak about the gentleness of God. For example, our favourite 23rd Psalm speaks of God as a shepherd who loves and cares and provides for his sheep. I love that story of Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19. Do you remember when Elijah was running away in fear of his life from Jezebel and fell into a kind of suicidal depression? And God finds him in the wilderness under a tree, wishing he could die. And what does God do? Well, basically God mothered him, let him sleep, and told him to wake up and eat his breakfast. And the food that God gave him was bread, fresh baked in heaven, delivered by an angel. And then God took him back to Mount Sinai, and yet again God gives him a kind of audio-visual demonstration of earthquake, wind and fire. But then the text says that God was not in those things. When God spoke to Elijah, it was what used to be translated as a still small voice, or in our modern translation, a gentle whisper. And then having dealt with Elijah so gently, God sends him back and restores him to his work. So the gentleness of God in the Old Testament is there. And then we could think of the gentleness of Jesus. There's an old children's hymn, do you remember? Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Well, it certainly didn't mean that Jesus was a wimp, that he could never speak strong words, that he was just always kind of nice to everybody, because we do know that Jesus could speak toughly and could deal with wrongdoing with a great deal of honesty and truthfulness. But he did it in a way that was gentle. In fact, there's that famous verse in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 and 29, where Jesus says this, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So it's not surprising then, with this background of stories in the Old Testament and with the teaching and example of Jesus that the Apostle Paul turned gentleness from being one of the despised qualities of the world that surrounded him into being one of the prime virtues of a Christian and one of the key elements of the fruit of the Spirit. Paul, of course, modelled it himself. Perhaps he didn't find it easy to be gentle, but when he had some very tough things to say to the church in Corinth, he prefaces what he says with these words. He says, "By the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you." So, what then is the source of that kind of countercultural gentleness? Well, says Paul, it is the fruit of the Spirit, and it grows within us as the Spirit lives within us. But I think particularly it comes from humility, which, as I said, is so often paired with gentleness. Humility is that deep self-awareness, that knowledge that I am just as flawed and human and tempted as anyone else. And so therefore, when somebody else makes a mistake, or drops and breaks something, or loses the car keys, or forgets to do what they promised, I remember that it could just as easily have been me. And so I don't respond with that anger and irritation, but out of humility and self-knowledge, I can respond with the gentleness of Jesus, the fruit of the Spirit.